So we saw our first important element, which was who is between two countries relatively abundant at capital and who is relatively abundant at labor. And so that was the concept of factor endowments. Now we are at our second important element for our economic model, which is the concept of factor intensity. Before, we were thinking about how much resources we have in an economy. Now we're thinking about technology. We will have in our economy two goods, and there's still going to be soybeans and textiles. But let's now think for a second to a different example, which helps us understand better the idea of factor intensity. We have grapes and we have cars. We're going to ask, how much labor does the production of grapes requires? How much capital does the production of grapes require? If we look at the picture here that I've reported, we see that picking grapes and producing grapes is an activity that will require a lot of manual labor, so a lot of labor, and not so much capital, not so many machines. If we think about the production of cars, then in the picture I've reported, you see a lot of robots and very few employees that are supervising and checking for error, mistakes, and so on and so forth. So that's an example of production that requires a lot of capital and, compare at least to grapes production, less labor. This is the idea of factor intensity. We are basically asking how much labor and capital does a production of one good requires. And we will say that the production of one good is labor intensive relative to the production of the other good if its production require more labor per machine than the other good. Mathematically, again, we are relating the amount of labor required to produce one unit to the amount of capital that is required to produce one unit. So we're doing something very similar to what we have done when we have seen the concept of capital abundance and relative labor abundance. But now, instead of doing it for the entire stock of resources in the economy, we are thinking about how much labor and capital we need to produce a specific good. Again, if the quantity of labor divided by the quantity of capital that is needed to produce one unit of one good is greater than the quantity of labor divided by the quantity of capital required to produce the other good, then we say that the production of the first good is labor intensive. And clearly, if the production of one good is labor intensive, it must be that the production of the other good is relatively capital intensive.